Shall we get started then? So, first an announcement or two. I know some of you went to the Monday meeting for the ACM. There's another one next Monday. Because I think the ACM is a really good student organization for people who are going to be computer scientists. I've been an ACM member since 1976 or something like that when I was undergraduate. I will always announce the meetings. This meeting on Monday is the same room as before, and of course the same pizza as before, so those are all good things. Also want to point out again, and I'll announce this every day until the conference, the Friday and Saturdays, February 25th and 26th, is the UICC Computing Conference. There are some nice door prizes for those who attend. That's kind of nice, and it should be fun. So if you are looking for something to do, it's likely to be cold. So here's your chance. Let's talk about a few administrative items. So first of all, you should have read these two chapters or these two chapters, 10 and 12 from Think Python, or the analogous chapters are 8 and 10 in Python for Everyone. And there's a reading Monday, chapter 11 or chapter 9. Now, we're doing a lot of readings. I'm giving you a lot of stuff to read. That'll soon subside. You'll find that Think Python is not a very good textbook, but is a pretty darn good reference book. So after you read this, you will continue to go back and look up stuff when you're doing your homework or question of the day. That's the intended use. So it's a reasonable reference for Python and something you'll want to keep nearby. Question of day 2 was due just before class today. Question of day 3 is going to be released at 10:30 today or whatever, whenever we're out of class. 11, I forget what the start time is. And it'll be due on Monday, again, before class. I'm going to talk about question of day 2 a little bit in a minute. Lab 1 was graded early yesterday morning. I had some autograder issues. You should have all gotten a PDF file with the output of your program. There are a few of you, the HawkID stuff, we're doing great. There are only a few typos in your HawkIDs. Please check those. I know there are a few students who failed to submit that worked on the code but then didn't hit the submit button or didn't upload the code to Icon. Not a lot I can do about that. But fortunately, we dropped the lowest grade, so you're still okay. Make sure that you submit the code. If you want to be double certain and you both submit it, both partners submit the same file, that's okay too. The autograder doesn't care. It'll handle that. But at least one has to show up in Icon or I can't grade it. Did anybody not get the PDF and was expecting to get it? Did you look at the PDF? Did it make sense to you? It should be mostly what you handed in. Then there's a few errors or warnings if you had them. I look first at the structure of the code. So for example, some of you like to write code where you have the define and then you have a bunch of assignment statements, one after the other. We'll talk about that a little bit today. And then you sort of all put it together in a return. And you might get something that says, warning, do you really need all those assignment statements? And the answer is you don't, right? So you'll see things like that about the structure of the code. And then the code will be run by the autograder against a set of test cases which are not the same that were provided in the example, just to make sure that your code really does work as intended and wasn't engineered to just work for the examples I gave you. And for each of those, you'll get a test point, so there'll be like 10 or 15 or 20 sometimes. As we go on, the term might be 30 or 40 test cases. And those points will tell me something about how well your code works. That is not your score on the assignment. That's sort of the base score. From that, there are style points that get added and deductions for violations of the spec. So for example, if the specification says do not use an if statement, and you use an if statement, it doesn't matter how many test cases you pass, you're not going to get any points for that function. Because it says don't use an if statement, and you use an if statement. So read the whole spec and honor the spec. Now, I admit, when I ran this, I got a few students who wrote back and said, how did I get negative points on this problem? And the answer is you shouldn't have. It should always be between, for the lab was 0 and 10 for the first lab. But somehow Icon assigned negative points to some of you. I still don't know why. That's been fixed, I hope. If something like that shows up, by all means write me and I'll look into it. All right, career fairs. There are 4 career fairs starting next week. Most of you, or I assume many of you, are freshmen. And you're thinking, why am I going to a career fair? I'm not ready to look for a job. But career fairs are also where students look for internships. So if you are a sophomore or a junior, you definitely should be going to the career fair to see if you can find a summer internship. These are paid jobs where you earn a lot of CS experience, which is what you need to land that future job. Many companies that hire interns will make an offer of employment full-time after that. But still, some of you as freshmen, you think, well, I'm in CS1, what do I have to offer? The answer is, you may not have a lot to offer now. But there's a culture to job fairs, and it's good for you to go, even if you talk to nobody, go and look around. And this is important because when it's important to go, you need to know how to behave, you need to know how to dress, you need to know how to interact. So you're kind of scouting it out if you go this year. Now, I talk about my daughter sometimes, but I will tell you this story, which is true. My younger daughter is an engineer, and her freshman year at a different school, she was in industrial engineering. They had the job fair in September. And I said to her, I always tell my students to go, freshman year. She says, I'm not going. I said, just go. And because she's conflicted about her father, she eventually went, right? How many of you are like this? Your father says something, it's like, I'm not doing it, but then you do it, right? So she did it. And she walked in, and there was a table in front at the engineering job fair, and the company was L'Oreal. Now, L'Oreal is the, I think, second largest manufacturer of cosmetics and beauty products. I didn't know that. It's a French company, right? And they were giving out free stuff. So she packed a bag of free stuff and left. She looked around, left. The next year, she went back, and they remembered her and hired her for a summer internship, which she had for 2 years. Her first job out of college was with L'Oreal, and she worked there for a year, and she loved it. And she wouldn't have had that job if she hadn't just gone to the career fair the first time. So you never know. It is worth an afternoon. It's worth an hour in the afternoon to go and try it out. If you're really serious about it, you go to the Career Center before that, talk to one of the student advisors, and write a brief resume. You should always have a resume, and you should keep it up to date. And you may as well start now writing that one pager, it's just one page, and having a few copies with you, or at least having it handy so you can email it to people that you meet at the job fair. So that's the end of today's advice session. Please do go, and if you go, post on Piazza what your experience is. Share with your classmates what you learned by going to the job fair. It's worth doing. Okay, Lab 1, there were 83 submissions from 163 people, because of course, paired. The pairing thing work out for you guys? Did you learn something from your partner? Was that worthwhile? Okay. There were only 4 Hawk IDs that didn't work, and they were all typos. An extra X added to the end. Those things I can fix. If your Hawk ID is Segre, and I get a Segre X that doesn't work, I can figure it out. The average score was 8.6 out of 10. There were 4 submissions that did not load into Python. And generally what happens then is you're working on the assignment, the 4 functions or 5 functions, and you put an extra indent station in one of the functions. Or you mess up the indenting, or you add a character at the end of a line of Python. If your code can't run, the autograder is going to punt. It's going to say, this isn't legal Python code, I can't run it. You would get an error that says illegal file error or illegal syntax error, and the autograder would assign you 0 points. Now, if this is your case, and you can see where you went wrong with the indentation and stuff, by all means, you and your partner should correspond. You should work on it together and see if you can get it straight. Write me and tell me what was wrong with your file, and I will throw out just the bad functions and regrade it by hand. All right? So it's, if the whole file punts because you made a mistake in one function that caused the whole file to break, it's up to you. The onus is up to you to correct it. Send me the corrected version and say, I fixed it. Explain what the problem was, and I will regrade the remaining functions, which could get you some points. Okay, Let's see, where were we here? Oh yeah, okay, so make sure you follow the specs. If the specification says your function should be one return statement, don't give me 7 lines of assignments. So, there is some value, and I get it. I see some code that people write, and they'll say, A equals a little bit of stuff, B equals some function of A, C equals some function of B, D equals some function of C. So every step is an assignment. And I think some of you had high school programming where this is what you did. And the reason you do that is because it makes your logical process clear, right? So it helps you understand you're breaking down the code into step by step, which is really great for you. It's really ugly code, right? Somebody says it runs slower. Yeah, it does. It runs a little slower. Computers are fast enough, it doesn't really matter. Certainly not for these problems. But what it does do is it adds a lot of unnecessary extra names floating around with values that you don't really need. So I don't like to use extra variables unless I plan to reuse that variable value, so I'm saving a calculation. I would much rather see the concise function defined with some human verbiage, a comment that says, this function takes two sequences to calculate the first part of the first sequence. I used integer division or something like that, than seeing this blow-by-blow thing. But that's stylistic. My job is to teach you to code, which means writing good code that's correct, that solves the problem, but also code that's stylistically sound. And everybody will develop their own style as you go through here. Unfortunately, since I'm in charge, I get to tell you what my style is and have you at least adopt it for the purpose of this class. Then after that, you're free to develop on your own. All right. So the moral here is that in this class, the lower bar of just getting your stuff to work isn't enough. You got to get it to work. It needs to look good. It needs to be understandable by the person reading it. It needs to be efficient. It needs to be tested. All those things have to happen. And by the way, I really like the Piazza questions. I see a lot of you are posting. I hope those of you who aren't posting are at least reading, because there's a lot of answers there. I will go through Piazza now that question of the day 2 is in, and reveal, sort of make unprivate the private question of the 2 questions. You guys will all still be anonymous, so you won't know who you are or who's posting it. But you can see what your classmates are struggling with, and you'll learn something from that as well. So it's worth going back and just reading Piazza, even if you're not actively posting there. All right. Finally, I get to eat some crow. I put this on icon yesterday or this morning, I forget which. You may remember this function from Lab 1. Determine if x, y, z are feasible sides of a triangle. One of your classmates, who is better at math than I am, wrote me a note and said, these 3 conditions are unnecessary because logically these 3 conditions entail those. So in other words, you'll never violate these conditions if you offer these. And so he rightfully or she rightfully points out that this is a more concise solution. So hats off. I'll be the first to admit when I messed up. Turns out that in grading Lab 1, it didn't matter which solution you used as long as you handled these correctly. So anyway, so that's for your consumption. Question day 2. So this was the question specification. There were a couple of hints below this. If I give you a hint, it really is meant to help you out. A number of you read the specification, started coding right away, and neglected to go back and look at the hint. And the result is you went down this long and winding path to perdition without actually solving the problem. The solution here is not that hard. But I think what I'd like to do is develop it live with you. You've all done it, so this should be easy. But just so you can see sort of how the thought process might work. And also because some of you had some problems with, how many of you had problems submitting with icon? A couple of you wrote today. It wouldn't show you the button, right? And I don't know why. I wrote to ITS Help Desk, they haven't answered, so we'll see. In that case, as you did, you sent me the file, that's fine, and we'll figure it out. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to submit your code and just send me emails. Don't do that. I have 14,000 plus unread emails. Please don't send me any more unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I've got a mock-up here. Oh, that's the icon page. Sorry, that's not the one I want. Here we go. So this is a browser that shows a question of the day facsimile. We're just going to solve it together. I just want to show you my thought process as I do this. And as we do this, I also want you to see how the browser environment works. This is a crappy environment to work with. It really is. But it's fast and easy. And for questions of the day, these are supposed to be brief experiences that you do. Get it over with. So just do it in a browser is really convenient. But it's not a real Python, so that sometimes comes back to bite you. So if I run this program, this is just the original template. By the way, the default name for this is questionoftheday2.py. But because it's a browser environment, if you solve questionoftheday1.py previously in the same browser session, that name may be different. Sometimes it shows up as main.py by default. It doesn't matter. You get to fix your own name. So if I run this, I see that I have an error that says, boy, you have 6 characters in Hawk ID. It should be your own name, so I'm going to fix that. If I run it now, I can see that my definition of splice sequence doesn't return a value. So I can scroll down a little bit and start working on splice sequence. I see what the sequence function does, and I have a hint about the links of the 2 parts. So I start thinking, before I start writing code, I'm just going to think. I know that my function is going to take the 2 sequences and somehow combine them. And in fact, the combination will have, it looks like a part of sequence 1 followed by a part of sequence 2. And I can see that better here. 1 and 3 is the first part of sequence 1, and 8 and 10 is the last part of sequence 2. So I'm just going to start with an approximation that I know is wrong. And that is simply the concatenation of S1 and S2. And if I run this, I get some error messages here. First of all, it looks like I got a bunch of extra stuff showing up that I didn't expect. A, B, C, D, E, E, D, C, B, A, which looks like sequence 1 and sequence 2 concatenated. But then I get this error that says my definition doesn't return a value. So I did something wrong. And before I go on and just try randomly, what does that really mean that it didn't return a value? Well, if I look at my sequence definition, splice sequence, I see I'm violating mantra number 2, which is that return is not the same as print, or better, print is not the same as return. So this function definition is printing the concatenation of those 2, but it's actually not returning anything. We're going to see shortly what it does return, which is the absence of something. So my first step is to fix this. And if I rerun it now, I can see that, okay, so the errors all went away except that I'm returning this thing instead of what I expected. And that's not a surprise because I didn't actually do anything. I just concatenated 2 sequences together. What I really needed to do is concatenate part of sequence 1 with part of sequence 2. And by goodness, we've just been talking about slicing sequences and taking subsequences in class. So I'm pretty sure I want to use some sort of indexing operation. So I'll set that up with the 2 indexing operators, which are the square brackets. And I also know that these things have to be, I'm going to have a start and an end for each one. And because there's nothing in this that implies I'm going to be skipping elements or going backwards, I'm not going to worry about the third argument, just beginning and end. So the first argument is going to be, where do I start with sequence 1? And the second part here is, where do I stop? And these are just going to be expressions that have to evaluate to integers. Likewise here, where do I start in sequence 2 and where do I end? Well, if I look at the specification, it tells me that it's going to splice the first half of sequence 1. So I know I'm going to start sequence 1 at the very beginning of the sequence, which is index location 0, or simply the blank index location, because by default, I always start from the beginning of the sequence. And I know I want to go halfway in sequence 1, so I'm going to change this here a little bit to just take the first half. Now, how do I take the first half? And what is this business about the first half of the odd sequence length is shorter than the second half? Well, these are a finite number of discrete elements. I cannot take, if there are 5 elements in the sequence, I'm going to return the first and second. I can't return half of the third. So this is telling you we're excluding 3, 4, and 5 and just returning 1 and 2 if the sequence is odd. If the sequence is even length, then it's 1 and 2 and not 3 and 4. That works. So how do I get half a sequence? Well, we talked about this in class on, what day is today? Today's Friday? Was it on Wednesday? Integer division takes an integer and always returns an integer. And if you take an integer division of an integer by 2, you'll get half of that integer length. So I need to have 2 integers here. I need the length of the sequence, which I get from, as we saw the other day, the length function. Right? And I want to divide that by 2, because I only want the first half of that. So this now tells me, take the first half of sequence 1. And what about for sequence 2? Well, in sequence 2, the opposite thing is at play here. I want to go from starting in the second half. Now remember, this says start at the beginning and go up to, but not including that element, which is the central element. So if I'm looking for the second half here, I actually want to start with that central element. Of course, here it's sequence S2. So I'll do this by doing length of S2 divided by 2. And I want to go right on to the end of the sequence, right up to the end. So by default, that's length S, or just leave it blank. If I run that, I get this message that says it passes the sample test cases. Of course, it doesn't say anything about whether your program is correct on everything. Why do I put that in? Because there are some students who are very inventive and build code that only works for the 2 examples I show. That doesn't mean it passes all the tests in general case. But if you've done your due diligence and you've built something like this, you can sort of ignore that. Check your work against the spec. That's to remind you, if it says do it in 1 line, that a 20-line code is not what I'm after. And when you're satisfied, download the file and submit it to Icon. And then it tells me when I exit. This has been the object of some discussion on Piazza. Some Pythons complain, some don't. I will try to change the template so that message goes away for the next problem. All right, so question on day 2, I'm going to download it. I'm going to keep it here. I'm going to go to the Icon submit button, upload that file, and you're done. Okay, now, what happens if I want to do the same thing? I reset this. I'm going to download it again in idle. Well, so here is the one I just downloaded. I'm going to edit this with idle, and it will bring up my file just like it did in the browser. Oops, sorry. How do you make this window bigger? I've forgotten. Oh, yeah, it's Windows. Jeez. All right, let's just do this. So it's the same template file. I have a different editor. It colorizes, which for old people is really nice because we don't see worth a darn. It's nice to see the colors that pops up. Colorizing is actually kind of cool because if you make a mistake with things like the quote marks, what you expect to be a string remains green, and sometimes stuff that shouldn't be green turns green. It sort of visually reinforces that you did something wrong. So now this process is pretty much the same. I can come up here and run this module, and that'll open a Python window, and it'll say, wow, I got an error. Replace the 6 characters in HawkID, and I get this kill thing here, and I'm going to say, yes, go ahead and kill it. So the same thing applies. HawkID, same thing here. Yeah, I got it. And now I can run it. It will force me to save it. It'll run it, and I'll get the same message, exactly like before. I'll get this funny program still running thing. This is the result of that exit statement, which is not appearing there, you'll notice, because it's a different, slightly different environment. And now, as long as I've saved the file, which it forced me to do before I ran it, I'm ready to upload this thing to Icon and be done with it. You can work in idle if you prefer. You can work in the browser if you prefer. Once we get into longer problems and more complicated code, this is much preferred. Don't work in the browser for anything beyond a simple function. That browser is just for your convenience. I found that students, because I give a lot of little problems, every day there's something, it's just much easier to go to the browser, do it, and get it done. If they have to download it and use Icon in this, students don't do it. And if you don't code every day, you're not going to learn. So that's the public service announcement for today. I hope that that will help you sort of know how to approach these problems better. All right, so this is the same stuff we talked about just now. There's a solution, and we're ready to go. Okay, questions? We good? It's a new question of the day today. It looks a little bit like question of day 2. If you followed this discussion, you'll have a head start on question of day 3. Okay. We've finished now sequence types and mapping types, and we've even finished the set types. Oops, this is upside down. We finished the set type. So now we're done with our base data types. We're ready to do something else. A few things to point out. We have a function called type, which when invoked on an object, tells us what type it is. It'll tell us if it's an integer, float, Boolean, and so on. We have some functions that convert things from one type to another. So if I take a character, I can turn it into an int sometimes. Some characters can't be integers. If I have a float, I can turn it into an int sometimes. It'll lose some precision. A Boolean can become an int. Ints can become Booleans. All these functions work most as expected and allow conversion back and forth. Now let's talk about the extra thing, the absence of a value. So I've told you before that print and return are not the same. Let's talk about that a little bit more in detail. There's a special constant in Python called none. You know, in our world, things are either true or false. They have a value or they don't. Not having a value is not the same as being false. It's the absence of something, which is hard to put a finger on. So none is this special constant that's built into Python that complements the Booleans in a way. It says none means there is no value. It doesn't mean the value is false. It means it's not there. So it is a constant, meaning that if I type it into the REPL, and I recognize that some of you are using IPython or Spider and your prompt will look different, it's still the same thing. Still using the read eval print loop, it just looks different. So if I type none, I get the new prompt. Notice that Python read in the none, evaluated it, found that it didn't have a value, didn't have anything to print at all because there's nothing to print, and then it prompted me again. So in the read eval print loop, if I put a 1 here, it'll evaluate, print the value 1, and then give me the prompt. Here there's nothing happened. Why? Because there's no value to read in. Am I going backwards? No, okay, so let's go on from none now. We'll skip that for a bit and come back to it because I'm going to show you some examples. So we've seen the numeric operations. We've seen the string and sequence operations. You've read about more operations on the sequence types than I've talked about in class. Just because it hasn't been said here doesn't mean they don't exist. You've read about them. I will provide you, probably on Monday, a very handy little cheat sheet that gives you the most commonly used ones, all on one page, front and back. It's a very handy programming crutch for beginners. I advise you to use it a bit, but not always, because sometimes the thing you're looking for, there's just exactly the right thing in the text or in the reference book. It won't be on the cheat sheet. So don't just think this is all the Python I need to know. It's a crutch, that's all it is. But I will let you have it because I think it helps accelerate your learning. So we're going to look at the operators for sets, which I introduced last week, but we didn't have a chance to talk about operations on sets, so we're going to do it now. The operators on sets are the ones that you remember from high school math: union, intersection, and so on. So you recall that sets have curly brackets. They look like dictionaries but without values, just with keys. And these are two sets of size 3. And the and sign is the intersection operation, which you probably know from set theory as the thing that looks like a U upside down, so with the curve on top. And so this is set intersection. It says, return the set that contains elements that are in both of the sets that were the operators. So here I have two sets. They share the 2 and the 3. That's the intersection. The pipe sign, this is called a pipe, up and down. The pipe sign represents not the intersection. It represents the union, which is the new set that combines elements from the two sets that are operators. And here, these 2 3-element sets, because they share 2 elements, the union will have a total of 4 elements. The elements that were unique from the 2 sets plus the elements that were in the intersection. And again, I'm ordering everything in order to make it easy on your eyes, but in Python, there's no order here. Well, what is the minus sign? The minus sign is a set difference operator. It says, return a set that consists of elements of the first set that are not elements of the second set. So this says, I have 3 elements here. 2 of them were in the intersection, so the remaining one is just the 1. Now notice that this operation, if I take the 2 operators and exchange them, right? If I commute the 2 operators, that'll give a different answer because now 2 is the odd operator element. Sorry, 4 is the odd operator. Yeah, they share 2 and 3, so 4 is the odd one out. So the difference, the ordering matters. For intersection and union, the ordering doesn't matter. And finally, there's a last set operator, this one here. This operator is called the symmetric difference. Symmetric because neither difference operator that we saw before is symmetric. The first operand is sort of more important than the second one. In the symmetric difference, we take the union of the output of the two differences. In other words, here, the return value is all of the elements of the first set, union all the elements of the second set, provided they're not in both sets. So if I take symmetric distance set 1 minus S2, union set 2 minus S1, I get this symmetric difference. I get the symmetric difference. Those are our set operators. And now that we know the basic operations for manipulating all of the built-in types that we've seen, we're ready to ask questions about those types. And you've already read, I think it was chapter 5 on conditionals, but we haven't really said anything about what things can be conditional expressions in an if statement. We've seen conditionals because conditionals are just expressions that evaluate to Booleans. And in fact, in feasible triangle, which we just saw again today, we had a collection of ands that collected a lot of individual conditions. X plus y greater than z is an individual condition. So next we're going to look at these comparison operators that return Boolean values. We've seen some. We saw the in operator on sequences. We've certainly seen these, but they merit some discussion. We know that L is less than, and we know that it works for numbers. Somewhat surprisingly, it also works for strings, where less than basically compares strings by alphabetical order, just like you look up in a dictionary. Less than or equal to, which is 2 characters next to each other, they have to be in this order, is the same except that it allows for equivalence testing. Greater than has the obvious meaning, greater than or equal to. Equal to is 2 equal signs together. Now this is really important. Mantra number 3 is that equal is not the same thing as equal equal. Is not the same thing as is. There are 3 things that are often confused. Equal and equal equal are the most often confused ones. We know equal as the assignment operation. We say x equals 7, and that's a way of giving the name 7 a value. But if I want to know if x is 7, if x's value is 7, I don't do it with the equal sign. I use the equal sign to test for equivalence. That's the condition that returns true if the current value of x is in fact the same as 7, or false if that's not the case. So equal to are two equal signs, and its inverse, not equal to, is two characters as well, where the first one is the negation bang. It's called a bang. Exclamation point is often called bang. So bang equal is not equal. Equal is equal. So a lot of these operators, like these operators here, work logically on things that aren't numbers, like sets. You know from high school math that we often ask the question, is this set a subset of that set? Or is this set a proper subset of that set? And what Python does, it co-opts less than and less than or equal to, greater than and greater than or equal to when operating on sets to provide subset and proper subset. And finally, beware that double equal is not the same thing as equal. So let's see these things in action. Just yell out true or false. 3 greater than or equal to 4. False. 5.0 greater than 5. Good. 0.0 not equal to 0. Why? So it's not equal. So let's ask the other question. Is 0.0 equal to 0? Now, they're not the same type, but the value is the same. 0.0 and 0 unambiguously stand for a value which is 0. So 0.0 and 0 are, in fact, equal. So if I ask if they're not equal, the answer is false. 4 not equal to 3.99999. They're not the same. You can have as many 9s as you want. If Python represents something as a 4 and something else is the 3.999, if Python shows you those representations and they look different, they're not going to be the same. The reason it's the same here is if I type 0.0 to Python, it's going to answer 0. That same value. Here, 4 will return 4 and 3.999 will return 3.999. Those are different. What about this? This is a little bit trickier because here I have one condition and another conditional expression joined together with a logical connector. This thing, and, is just an operator on Booleans. And each condition itself is something that returns a Boolean. So to answer this question, I have to ask myself, is minus 200 less than 60? The answer is yes. And is 60 less than 200? And the answer is yes. So this is true, true and true gives me true, and I'm good. Now, I've spoken to you before about syntactic sugar in Python. Remember we talked about syntactic sugar, about not 7 in 137, becoming 7 not in 137? The same thing applies here for chaining of inequalities. Python allows removal of the and merging of the two center elements. So this expression in Python is understood to be about exactly that expression. Oops, sorry. And that's really just because mathematicians are used to writing this. So you might have a statement where you have a value x and you want to make sure it's between 0 and 5. So you might write 0 less than x less than 5. That's legal. What about orbit and ordinary? Which one comes first? True or false? How many falses? How many trues? If you look it up in the dictionary, you would do this. These are sequence types. You would do this by comparing the first character. And if they're the same, you compare the second character. And if they're the same, the third character. But here, B comes before D. So this is actually true. Just the way you look something up in the dictionary, right? Same characters just flush until you get to a character, the first character that disambiguates it. What about this? Well, you know enough to know that a capital O and a lowercase o are not the same thing. So you're probably sitting here wondering, well, how does this work out? Well, the answer is that the uppercase O, every uppercase letter actually comes before its lowercase equivalent in collating order. What that means is it's set up internally in the coding system for encoding characters. You may know it as ASCII or UTF-8 or whatever, so that alphabetical order is the natural ordering of things. And what that means is that capital letters take precedence over lowercase equivalents. What about this? These are tuples, by the way. I can compare tuples for greater than. Which tuple is greater than which other tuple? Is this true or false? Remember, strings are sequence types just like tuples. So the same rules apply. Compare the first character. Is 1 greater than 3? The answer is no. You're done. This is false. Exactly like alphabetical order, but here they're numbers. What about this one? Well, 1 is less than 3. 2 is not less than 2. And this is strictly less than. Wait. Oh, no, sorry. 1 is less than 3. I'm done. 1 is less than 3, so I'm done. The tuple ordering, it's like alphabetical ordering. Compare the first ones, you break the tie, you're finished. What about this? We know in tests for whatever structure you have here, does it contain this value? What kind of structure is this? What is it? Curly brackets with colons, what is it? It's a dictionary, right? Mapping type, where you have a key and a value, key and value, key and value. And when I'm testing for inness of a value in the dictionary, I'm referring to the key, not the value. So this says, is 0 a key in this dictionary? And the answer is yes. Is 3 a key in this dictionary? The answer is no. 3 is a value, but not a key. But because I have the not, remember, it gets moved in, so 3 not in this, the answer here is also true. 5 in the list, 1, 2, 3, absolutely not. Okay. So set comparisons, which we talked about before, differences, inclusion, and so on, are overloaded on the less than or equal, and so on. These are subsets. So is 2, 1 a subset of 1, 2? Now remember, sets are not ordered. So these two sets have exactly the same elements in them, despite the order. So is the first set a proper subset of the second set? Remember high school math. If a set has to be a proper subset, means that the set on the left has every element of the set on the right, but the set on the right contains at least one additional element. These two sets are equivalent, exactly the same element. So one is not a proper subset of the other. However, it is a subset of the other because you drop that condition that the second set must have an additional, at least one additional element. So this is true. Is 1 a proper subset of 2, 1? Well, 1 is in this set. Elements of this set are all in this set. And yet there's one element of the first set that's not in the second. So the answer is true. Is the empty set a proper subset of the set 2, 1? What do you think? How many think yes? How many think no? There's a few iconoclasts. The answer here is yes. The empty set is a proper subset of every other set. Right? Because every element in the empty set is in the second set. All of the elements of the empty set are in this other set. There aren't any elements, so the answer is true. And this other set has extra elements, so it is a proper subset. Oh, shoot. Anybody know what I did wrong? I fell for it. Any hints? So I cut off the slide in a dramatic place here. What's the next word here? The next word here is dictionary. Why? Because this thing, what is this thing? It's not the empty set. Could be the empty list. It could be the empty tuple. But curly brackets, which are shared between sets and dictionaries, two curly brackets are the empty dictionary, not the empty set. All right? So this breaks because the two curly brackets here, this is a dictionary. Is that a proper subset of this set? I'm comparing apples and oranges, literally dictionaries and sets. It doesn't like that. Because of the choice of letting sets be special cases of dictionaries where there are no values, I'm left with the unfortunate situation that Python doesn't know there's no unique interpretation of this thing. The two curly brackets, it could be the empty set, it could be the empty dictionary. Which is it? Python has decided that is an empty dictionary. And that is what it's going to be. So that leaves me with no way of saying the empty set except to use the set constructor as a proper set of. This is what the empty set looks like. This is an empty dictionary. And here I get true. So this slide should remind you that set for the empty set has a similar sort of syntactical danger here that we had for tuples 1, comma, right? Which is the tuple of length 1 rather than the algebraic grouping of the number 1. So those two hidden gotchas will get you. And there's a number of these sort of false friends. Anybody know what a false friend is from language class? I have 3 minutes. False friends, no language majors? Any Italian speakers here? None? I had a good friend when I lived in Italy for a period of my life many times, and I had a very good friend, American, Italian-American, and we would get together and go out and drink beer. Not very often, and not a lot of beer, but we would occasionally see each other. And occasionally, these language idioms that are expressions that make sense in one language, when translated directly, are really foolish in the other language. So he said to me one day as I got off the subway, he said to me, "Make yourself alive." So what does that mean? Well, in Italian, fatti vivo means make yourself alive. Literally means call me. Right? So let me hear from you. Call me. Make yourself alive. These things, this empty dictionary, the absence of the comma, those are false friends. They take the interpretation of algebraic parentheses or the interpretation of curly brackets as dictionaries, even though it makes perfect sense for those things to be an empty set or the tuple of length 1. And there's no way around it. You're just going to have to remember them. Right? So, unfortunately, these things happen in any language. I'm trying to show you what they are so you won't come up against them. But there you have it. Okay, I think we're done for today. We're going to pick up on evaluations of complicated expressions on Monday. Now that we have types, we can write some pretty complicated expressions. We'll do that. And then I think our next step is to start our first project, which will be, not surprisingly, a word game, I believe. All right, have a great weekend. Don't forget question of the day 3.